Okay, so coal regulations, like so many other regulations that we face, are put in place in such a way that they're very difficult for Congress to overturn. There is something called the Congressional Review Act that allows us, every time a new major rule comes up, to pass what's called a resolution of disapproval. If each House of Congress can pass a resolution of disapproval and get it signed into law by the President, then the regulation at issue falls. It doesn't take effect. Here's the problem with that, though. In 20 years since the Congressional Review Act, which allows for this resolution of disapproval process, 20 years, we've had that process succeed exactly once, really only once. And this is perhaps no surprise, because any presidential administration that is willing to issue a regulation is likely to be headed by a president who's going to be inclined to veto a resolution of disapproval, disapproving of one of that president's regulations. That's why we need to flip this on its head, and it's one of the reasons why Congressman Ratcliffe and I are working together to try to push forward proposals like the REINS Act. REINS stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. And what the REINS Act says is that anytime we have a new one of these major rules, one that has a significant economic impact, it will not take effect unless Congress affirmatively passes it into law and the President signs it into law. In other words, we're flipping the presumption. Instead of the presumption being that the regulation will take effect automatically, we have to pass it into law. It's what the Constitution requires anyway, and it's what we ought to follow. Congressman, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, you know, coal is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Being from Texas, that's a big part of our economy there, and I certainly agree with your points. I actually drafted the resolutions of disapproval in the House that ultimately became part of the bill in the Senate that you all pursued, and it really, it speaks to that issue, again, really the core of the problem that we have. You talked about, Senator, the Congressional Review Act only being successful one time in 20 years to deal with regulatory overreach. And one of the things I'm excited about, back to the Article 1 project, is finding solutions and maybe ideas that will help us address this in a more effective way. When it comes to overriding the veto, all of your listeners know that that's a tremendous burden for members of Congress to override a presidential veto. Maybe we ought to consider coming up with a legislative fix that, when it comes to regulations, reduces that 2/3 veto that we would have to meet. And I know we want to have discussions about that. We're early in this Article 1 project, but those are the kinds of solutions that I think will provide relief to those that are feeling the oppression of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats at federal agencies that are taking the laws that we pass and adding on countless regulations that really distort congressional intent.
That's right. That's right. It's been a longstanding problem. This whole idea of passing laws through executive branch agencies without a vote of Congress really originated in the 1930s during the New Deal era. It was part of FDR's New Deal, was to develop this kind of lawmaking. But even the architect of the New Deal era regulatory structure, which remains in effect in many ways to this day, a Harvard law professor named James Landis, who was part of FDR's brain trust, he advised President Roosevelt correctly that constitutionally speaking, in order for this regulatory process to work, any new regulation that really had the force of law, that was binding on the American people, would need to go through Congress. It would need to be passed into law by Congress and signed into law by the President. For reasons that are not entirely clear, FDR and Congress failed to heed that warning. And for reasons that mystify and dumbfound many to this day, the Supreme Court has refused to enforce this aspect of the Constitution. Sometimes the Supreme Court does that, and especially when it does, it becomes that much more important for Congress to step in and for Congress to follow the Constitution, even where it won't be forced to do so by the courts.